Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KISS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of organic growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Our guest today is Nelson Lindsley of Poetry of Plants. You can check him out on Instagram under Poetry of Plants. Nelson has been cultivating cannabis for over a decade and working in the industry for over 2 decades. Over the last 3 years, he has consulted on cultivation sites in Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and California. Nelson has been on the podcast before and is a popular guest. I wanted to get him back on here to talk about an upcoming project we are working on, as well as cover a range of topics ranging from bottled nutrients to lighting.
I'm excited to have you back on the show to talk about, a few different things. So let's start off telling listeners a little bit about our new project.
Sure.
Can you tell them about the Dope History podcast and what that really is all about?
Yeah, I can. The Dope History podcast is going to be a collection of narratives from individuals that have been in the cannabis community and cannabis world for the last, 30, 40 years, all inclusive. So what we're doing is highlighting particular journeys and narratives of individuals that have built the foundation for the cannabis market that we have today.
So Nelson and I will be co-hosting this. It's going to be called the Dope History Podcast. You can go to dopehistory.com to check it out, and I'll have all the information coming out with links all on the podcast page for this podcast. But this is purely a labor of love. It's something that we're both really excited about doing together as a project, just to share some of these really, really amazing stories. So our hope is people, while they're working in their room or sitting back having a joint, they can just hear some of the history around this plant and some of the things that people have gone through to get us to where we are today.
Great story. Like if there was a campfire, it would be perfect, but we can't do that digitally, right?
Yeah, for sure. There you go. So just something to chill, listen to, and kind of understand what we've gone through with this plant and our culture and some of the laws and the way, some people have given up so much or gained so much by cultivating or transporting or being related to this plant somehow, spiritually connected.
Yeah, I mean, we have stories on there from like guys that were kicking it in the 70s and 80s and some pretty amazing stories. A lot of the history of, the psychedelic movement even, and where all that came from. I don't know. It's pretty wild. It's awesome. It's an honor.
Let's not give it all away. So
all right.
They're going to have to check out the podcast. So
right.
Let's get into this podcast, though. I'm excited to have you back on. And
thanks for having me.
I was trying to think of topics because you and I have conversations all the time and they just ramble on and they all seem pretty interesting to me. But I was trying to think what could we focus on today? And one question I wanted to ask you was, do you think bottled nutrients are still relevant today? Are they something, within the cannabis industry that are maybe a sort of a dinosaur in some respects? Or do you think that they're improving and really are the future of cannabis cultivation?
So I'm going to throw a curveball and I'm going to say maybe not. And I'm going to say that because number one, I'm not a chemist. Number two, I'm learning more about the formulations and so if we're talking about, we'll talk about the synthetic type fertilizers, right? Because it's almost two different worlds. For organic inputs, side note, is the fish hydrolysate considered a bottled nutrient?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Right?
It's not you're not buying a brand though. You're buying a product. So I would say no. That would be like saying, ammonium nitrate is a bottled nutrient.
Well, I think we're talking about a delivery system, right? Because
sure.
And if we're talking about a delivery system, we're saying a bottled nutrient is the fertilizer mixed with water. And so we've criticized, a lot of people, well, we've talked about it, buying water, shipping water doesn't make a lot of sense, economically or operationally. But what I've learned is that with synthetic nutrients, if you are going to be super anal and exact about your percentages. Sometimes you have to have it pre-mixed by an actual chemist to get it 100% accurate. Is that needed for production? Not really. I don't think so. Some people think so. Some people want it to be perfect. And what I've learned when you're scooping out your water soluble blends bag of fertilizer is that every single one of those minerals has its own specific weight, and how that bag of fertilizer is mixed up. And then when you're scooping it into your reservoir, you may or may not be getting the actual correct combination of minerals that you think you are based on how you're scooping and how you're measuring. So that's where the little caveat to all of it is. So if it's being blended for you beforehand, you know exactly how much calcium, how much magnesium, how much iron, and that's all done by weight by the chemist into the bottled nutrient. Now, I do not think that most bottled fertilizer companies, cannabis fertilizer companies are, I mean, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't think that they're really going to that level of detail when they're making their fertilizers, just because I've run tests on it, and I'm not going to name any names, and we've talked about this before, but I've seen wide ranges of differences in the minimum and maximums of the fertilizer levels. So are those products, those perfected bottled nutrient products out there? I don't know. I haven't really seen it. I know that there's some companies that are working on getting better at that. But for right now, I would still lean more towards the water-soluble fertilizers, although there are some associates of mine who are having their fertilizers mixed by some specialists and are working on creating, the perfect cannabis fertilizer, whatever that is. So are bottled nutrients dead? I think in this current iteration, yes. I think there's room for something else to come out of it, but I don't know if it's going to make sense at scale. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was a bit of a loaded question, I'll be honest. I mean, I've been a pretty loud critic of bottled nutrients in general for quite a while now, trying to get growers to just read the label and then look at the ingredients and sort of formulate their own. Now, that being said, when we talk about synthetic nutrients and some of the aspects, yes, we do need to continually feed the plant nutrients. We can't expect all of our nutrients to be in the media. And, even as someone who sells living soils and water only soils, I do think there is benefit to continual feeding. I think that the plant will actually thrive and do a little bit better if you are able to give it a little bit of nutrients throughout the cycle. But that being said, I think we give bottled nutrient companies way too much credit in terms of, QC and quality control and the innovation that went into the products that they're creating. I think a lot more money and time probably went into their branding than it did into the actual formulation of the product in a lot of cases.
I agree. Well, I want to say one thing about just a little side note. So I finally had the opportunity, now that I moved out of LA, to grow some plants outside. And for my indoor plants, I still use the synthetic blend and I add my organics in. But outside, I do not use any bottled nutrients at all anymore. I've used some of your soil, which has been fantastic. And I'll make amended soil and I just feed it water. And I have gotten to the point where it's so much easier just to do it that way. And the product that comes out and the health of the plant is better than 90% of anything that I grow indoors. And there's so very little that I have to do. I just have to, have a nice soil blend that has the right proper fertility. And, I talked to Coot the other day, and Coot turned me on to a couple little things I can add into the soil. And it's just been amazing to see what you can do without having to go to a synthetic fertilizer. And I would more, say that I'm moving into this place where the Al Natural, sun grown, there's just a joy to it where I don't have to be screwing around pH meters, EC meters, and all of that, and it's just easier, and I have less problems. Why is that different under the sun and the light, indoor light, artificial light? I think it just has to do with the power of the way this planet was built. Just a little side note on that, because I don't think we've talked about the fact that I've been moving away. I am almost looking at indoor cultivation now. I mean, there's a lot of indoor cultivation, but I'm almost looking at indoor cultivation as more of an R&D space and less of a space for commercial production, just because how much easier it is to be growing outside.
Well, that makes sense where you're located down in California, but up here in Washington, especially in Western Washington near Seattle, we just don't have the weather. It's really, you're rolling the dice as to whether or not your plants will actually finish, depending on how the weather is come October. So maybe moving towards, autoflowers is a solution to some of that. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, outdoor is great. It does bring up other challenges like the weather, and you don't have the same levels of control, but you do get all the benefit of unlimited root space and beneficial and predatory insects just naturalizing in your environment. And sunlight. Like, there's a ton of benefits to it for sure.
I'm still putting the plants in pots. I mean, forgive me. So I'm still making my own soil. Working on I've got some hemp plants in the ground, and that's been going well. But still, I still am leaning towards growing cannabis in pots so I can control the amount of amendments that are actually in the substrate.
Oh man, see, I'm the total opposite. I will put a plant in the ground 99% of the time. The only times I don't recommend going into the ground are if you have really bad moles and voles or things that are going to eat the roots and kill your plant that way. Or if you're in a floodplain where your water table is so high that it's an issue. But coming from a nursery background, growing up on a plant nursery with my parents, you take two plants and you put one plant in a container and you put one plant in the ground. Even if the ground soil is somewhat subpar, that plant in the ground is going to outperform the plant in the container 99% of the time. It's amazing. For some of the reasons I just listed. I would love to see you do an experiment. Take two plants. You don't even have to do a soil test of your soil. I mean, I don't know a lot about your soil, but my guess is if you put one in the ground and put that same, another clone in good soil, put it in our soil and run them side by side and see how it compares.
Yeah, I mean, that makes all the sense in the world. And that just has to do with the amount that the roots can grow, right? There's no limiting factor.
Yeah, root space isn't, like you said, is no limiting factor.
In the fungal environment.
Yeah, the soil typically has, pretty good microbial life. You're going to have, it's going to have more soil structure, and there's a lot we don't know, honestly, going on there too. But in general, like I have mulberry trees at my farm, and I have some in containers that have, been root bound now that are probably 2 feet tall. And I have the same mulberry tree in the chicken yard that is now 15 feet tall. And part of that is because we haven't up potted our mulberries appropriately to get them to the size they want. But a lot of it too is once we put that plant into the ground, it just took off. And watering's another thing there too, because when you're in the ground, you don't need to water as much. You sort of have a natural mulch. The plant's able to pull up water out of the soil a lot more efficiently than it can out of a container. So a lot of benefits.
Even a clone, because a clone is lacking a taproot.
Well, yeah, everything I'm saying is under the caveat that once the plant is established.
Understood.
Yeah,
got it.
That's a good point. Now, since we're talking about sort of random things, I kind of wanted to change directions. One of the things that you posted on your Instagram a while back related to flushing and organic plants. Do you want to kind of summarize how that discussion went and sort of what your thoughts on it? Because I think we have a similar view. I mean, it's...
Yeah, I just, everyone's been flushing cannabis that I know for the last 7 to 14 days of the life of the plant. So prior to harvest, practices to deprive the plant of nutrients and just give it water. And the thought behind that was that it created a better quality product because you were flushing out the nutrients out of the plant. And I hear, I go online and I see a lot of people talking about that. And it just didn't make sense. Like, I didn't understand how pouring water into the plant would remove the nutrients with that mode of action. So the way that it was being described and talked about seemed to be incorrect to me. And so I put a couple posts up. Actually, it was a repost from another guy that had a very excellent description of what actually was going on. And I suggested that we stop calling it flushing the plant and started calling it starving the plant. And that's, removing the fertilizer. Then you've got various things that happen. The plant starts using its stores of energy, and you start getting nutrient deficiencies. Essentially, is what it really looks like. And in that deficiency, I think there's a stress response that happens that may increase the cannabinoid content and terpene content as a defense mechanism, or as the death throes of the plant, as it's realizing it's not getting any more food. It's kind of ended at the end of its reproductive cycle. And that's what's actually creating the increase in quality. A lot of people talk about it having a taste, that if you don't flush, that you're going to get a poor tasting product on the smoke. And I don't know if that's the direct result of it either. People discuss about chlorophyll, like you're flushing out the chlorophyll. That doesn't make sense to me. And it just seemed like there was an unscientific practice being put into place and being claimed as a scientific practice. Do I understand everything that's going on when we flush the plant at this moment? No, I'm still learning and figuring all of that out as I, go talk to other, PhDs and people that know a lot more about horticulture than I do. And I talk to them about this flushing the plant thing. They just kind of chuckle and laugh and say, "What are you talking about?" They've never even heard of that before. And I then have to explain to them what's going on. And then they have to decipher what the common understanding of it is to what's actually happening. And there hasn't been a ton of research done on flushing the plant, just because there aren't a lot of other industries that do that. There aren't a lot of other agricultural crops where they're actually flushing the plant. Now, one thing I will say on that is cannabis is an amazing bioaccumulator of chemicals and minerals. So perhaps giving it that water allows the cannabis plant to release something that they've bioaccumulated that could affect the quality. That would be the only thing that I could think of that would support this quote unquote flushing terminology.
So here's my take on it. Now, one thing, especially in, when you're growing with mineral salts, is you can have a buildup of salt content in your media, and you can also have excess nitrates in your media. And I think that by removing those, by flushing the plant, or removing them out of the media by adding excessive water, you can improve the quality of your final product. So I think there's a few things going on. Now, in organic soil, you don't have a bunch of ionic nutrients just hanging out in the media, and you typically don't have a buildup of salt content. So it doesn't really make sense to flush your plant for the same reasons. There's no excess nitrates to remove. But that being said, does, as you said, starving or stressing your plant create a stress response that's somehow going to improve the quality of the final bud? Well, maybe. But I've seen a lot of great organic growers that don't flush their plants that produce really, really good, high quality, what I would consider top shelf cannabis and top shelf flower. So to me, flushing is a bit of a myth. Now, if we want to start looking at creating stress responses in cannabis plants at various stages of growth and how that may affect, cannabinoid levels or terpene content in the plant itself, I think that is something that we could study. using science and research, but I don't think that flushing is really the right, like you said, the right terminology, or really what we want to do with a plant. I would challenge people to go ahead, if you are growing in organic soil, go ahead and try flushing one plant and compare the final flower. And I don't think you'll see an improvement personally, but that's my take.
How do you flush an organic? I mean, you're not really, when you're feeding, are you talking about feeding the plant organic inputs through a solution or an organic? Because when I have an organic soil, I'm very rarely feeding it, any kind of fertilizer solution. All of it's kind of already either mixed into the soil or top dressed. So how would you flush? That's what I don't understand. How would you flush an organic plant? I can get if you have like a fairly inert low ECC substrate and then you're trying to flush out or purge those nitrates. I still don't understand how that affects the taste. I don't understand how that works when people make those claims. But how would you flush an organic plant?
Well, so here's the argument as I understand it. So if you want to take a soilless media that is potentially high in nitrates, and you remove those nitrates by adding a lot of water, that plant is going to have less nitrogen to take up. Therefore, it's going to have less chlorophyll production, and therefore it's going to have less green in its leaves, and potentially maybe have less chlorophyll overall when you smoke it. I guess that would be my take on that. From an organic soil perspective, you're right. There's amendments being added or ingredients in terms of nitrogen that's not in a plant available form. And so that has to be processed by the microbiology in the soil into nitrate or into ammonium. But essentially some of that may be washed out through a flushing process, but it's not at excessive levels in general. Now, from a farming perspective and agriculturally, you always add nitrogen in the spring because of the heavy rains that you get will flush it out of your system. So they don't even test for nitrogen in a lot of times on these soil tests because they just assume that your soil is going to be deficient. Now that's when we're talking about agricultural land. Now when we talk about soilless media indoors where we're not getting that excessive water addition, we could potentially have too much nitrogen or too many nitrogen amendments. So there is a balance there, I guess, but it's not something that I think you're correcting with the last week or 14 days of your plant's life. It's something that you need to be managing throughout the entire growth cycle as you sort of balance and manage your soil.
Yeah, I'll use flushing if let's say I have too much of a dry down period on my medium, the EC is going to climb, and that might not be suitable for whatever stage of growth the plant's in. So there'll be times if I made a boo-boo or I made a mistake and I've got to correct that, and I use flushing to, clean out the medium and kind of reset the medium for proper plant growth. But I'll still flush with a small amount of fertilizer because I'm not trying to starve the plant in the middle of its cycle, just to kind of get it back into balance. So I will use that practice. But at the end, at the end of the cycle, I've done it where I've flushed it I've flushed a lot, thinking that this is what you're supposed to do and that this is going to create quality flower. And about 2 years ago, I started to slowly bring down the amount of days that I would give it water. And I'm like, you know what, I'm going to cut this down when it's ready, and I'm not going to starve it until I think it's ready. And I'm at a point now where I'll give it water for 2 or 3 days and cut it down. And I don't notice, and no one else who uses the flower notices that it tastes funny or has too much of some residual something or other in it. And I think that the taste issue has more to do with properly drying the product and allowing it to cure. Is what and the ash burning, a lot of people say, well, the ash is burning black, that means it wasn't flushed. Well, that doesn't make any sense to me. If the ash is burning black, it's either too wet or there's some other chemical that was sprayed on it. That's my thought on it. What do you think?
I am not a cannabis consumption expert, so I'm going to not weigh in on that one.
Okay, got it. Have you heard that conversation before?
I have, but I don't have enough experience, honestly. Like, I know Coot, for example, will tell you that anything that was grown with chemicals to him tastes like a burned up rubber tire. And he can just tell right away if it was grown using mineral salts. I don't claim to have any level of sophistication around, well, frankly, anything, wine or cannabis. As much as I wish I had a better palate, I really don't. So I'm going to stay out of that one. But one thing I did want to bring up relating to flushing before we move on to the next topic is some of the concerns around it too. So when we stress our plant, we may get a good stress response, but we're also opening it up to more pest pressure. We're increasing the humidity in our rooms potentially, which can lead to more opportunity for certain fungal pathogens like botrytis or powdery mildew. So
Correct.
These are some of the dangers, I guess, or concerns around excessive watering or any sort of practice that's going to create a stress response.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that you would be watering more often if you were flushing. You don't want to, drown the roots, right? So I don't think that your latent load, which is the amount of water that's in the air, or the transpiration, the water that's being transpired by the plant, should go up whether you're flushing or giving it just a regular solution for the last 2 weeks. I would say that any stress response at the end of a cycle, if you have an unstable genetic, could cause the plant to hermaphrodite, which is what I see often. Is flushing the plant cause the plant to hermaphrodite? I don't know. I just know that we have a lot of unstable genetics on the market right now, and one faux pas can create banana pollen sacs. So I would suggest everyone do a trial, like you said, but with whatever methodology they're using, try flushing on 1 or 2 plants and try not flushing on 1 or 2 plants, and really give it a fair, blind taste test or an analysis.
So one thing that you mentioned a little bit ago when we were talking about outdoor plants was not using your EC or pH meter anymore on your outdoor plants. And there's a recent discussion online about whether or not you need to ever pH your water if you're growing organically or with organic soil. And I have a pretty strong opinion on this, but I was going to let you go first if you have any thoughts on the subject, or I'm happy to chime in and start the discussion.
Yeah, I think the first thing you need to do is check before you're feeding your plants any of your water, you need to check, get a water test done and make sure that it's suitable for plant health. I lived in LA for a while, and sometimes the pH was all over the map and not within that suitable for growth range, which, from how I understand it, is somewhere between, 5.5 and 7.5. So if it's around there, I don't know if it's that important, because the soil will do a lot of the pH buffering for you. Indoors, it's a little bit more, it's a little trickier especially when you're dealing with the soilless media, and that's where you do have to pay attention to it. But and I don't know how you feel about it, so we haven't talked about this, but I've been having great results after checking my water. It's around 6.8 to 7.2. It's kind of where it comes out. And I haven't really made any pH adjustments, and I don't notice any nutrient deficiencies in the plant. But I haven't gotten a leaf tissue test done on my outdoor plants. So I'm just basing it off of what I can see.
Well, you have pretty perfect water. I mean, that to me, 6.8 is pretty damn
Perfect.
Good. Yeah.
Yep.
And what I was hearing is people have water as high as 8 or 8.1. And to me, people are saying, no, don't worry about pHing your water. You don't need to do it. No matter what, the soil contains sufficient, if it has good microorganism levels and diversity, it will buffer the pH for the plant in the rhizosphere, which is correct. Like you said, soil does have much higher buffering capacity, but I don't think if we want to talk about optimal plant health and plant growth, we want to be watering with things that are within optimal pH ranges too. I don't think we get to throw the pH pen completely out the window we need to still know what we're starting with. And that's something that, we were getting into an argument with these guys because we didn't agree. So since this is my podcast, I get to share my opinion, which is we do need to know what the pH of our water is. So you always need to start off knowing, what's in your media, what's in your water, because you can't develop a fertilizer schedule or a fertigation program until you know those two things, because you just don't know what you're starting with. And I think that's so important. It's something that Travis Higginbotham mentioned in his podcast that I just released. And it's something that I think everyone needs to think about. So
I 100% agree with you on that. I mean, you need to know what your starting inputs are. Otherwise, if you have an issue or you have a problem with the plant health and you didn't collect all the information for everything that you're putting into the plant, you're not going to know how to address the problem. And again, like you said, there's a suitable range for growth. That's pH, that's humidity, that's temperature, right? Photo period. I think did I miss any? I mean, that's pretty much right around where we need to pay attention to this kind and fertility. Or soil fertility. So if you don't know what you've got going on there, then you're flying blind. So yeah, I 100% agree. But if the water coming out of the tap is in the suitable range, and you're doing some kind of infrequent or frequent weekly testing or daily testing to make sure if you're like on a well, it shouldn't slide too much. But I will say one thing: if you're on a well, and I've seen this a lot, if you are on let's say you let's use a hypothetical situation that I've seen. If you buy a property and got your cannabis cultivation license and you're going to start growing, and you get a water test on the well and it looks great, but you haven't really hit that well yet. You haven't really started pumping water out of that well. Make sure you're doing frequent tests on that well, because what I see from a lot of wells all around the country is that after that well starts to you start pulling water out of that well, start using it, you'll start seeing iron filling up in the filters. And I'm seeing it across the way, and people just keep going ahead, and they have got their dechlorinator sediment filter, which is doing nothing. And they get these super high levels of ferrous iron. And then they go back to their water test that they did before they actually started using the well. And they're like, well, my water looks fine. Well, you need to be doing frequent water tests from your well water or municipal water to understand what's going on. You can't just do one water test and expect that you're going to be golden. And I see that, Tad, I see that all the time. And then they have plant problems. And then I go check the filters, and the filters are orange with like ferrous iron and clay covered all of them. And I'm like, guys, what's going on here? Where's the water test? When was the last time you had a water test? And they're like, oh, we had a water test a year ago. Here it is. And I'm like, well, that's not what your actual water is anymore. And there's a great guy. I'm going to give him a plug, and hopefully he doesn't kill me for this, but David Berlin over at Hyperlogic is one of the best, water purification, water masters, who I send pictures of these filters all the time to him. And, we kind of like, oh, here we go again. Tell them to get a current water test. So I just wanted to put that out there. It's very important to be constantly testing your water as you're using that water source.
Yeah, farmers from an agricultural perspective will know that their water is going to change throughout the season. And so they make adjustments accordingly. And, for some of the reasons you mentioned, and just some of the seasonal changes with excessive rains, bringing down things out of the mountains and stuff like that, and erosion. So good point. So let's get into, we haven't even talked about some of the stuff that I really wanted to talk about, which was this new trial that you're setting up.
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Some of your findings, the reasons why you did it. Let's talk about some of the aspects of your trial in terms of controlling for a variable that may not be perfect.
Yep. So I started working with LED lighting. What was it? 3 or 4 years ago now, and I worked with a lot of the initial kind of subpar LED fixtures that were out there, and then Fluence came around and had some good results with it, but also had some challenges like everybody else did in making the transition. And now we're kind of now that Fluence really was the trendsetter in turning making the paradigm shift to some extent. on, really looking at LED lighting as a excellent choice or solution for indoor controlled environment lighting. Now you've got a lot of other companies that have jumped on the bandwagon. And you have a whole market. I mean, you go to some of these trade shows and it's like a city of LED lighting. And I've been primarily working with Affluence Lighting, and I'm started seeing some interesting results and different kinds of results from other lighting companies that were developing different ways of delivering the photons, whether that may be spectrum or footprint or additional features. So I reached out about 6 months ago to other lighting companies that I had seen some interesting results from, or I'd heard from other consultants or other growers that they were having good results from and are happy with the fixtures. And I wanted to kind of do an imperfect trial and see if any of these other lighting companies be willing to kind of go up against what my standard has been, which has been the Spider X Plus primarily. And also for me to see whether where we're at on the market of LED lighting, and where certain companies are doing better things than other companies, and hopefully putting this out publicly will improve everyone's product that they're putting out and provide data to the consumer, and also perhaps look at. I mean, so the way that I have the trial set up, it's a fairly small little lab space, and so I've got kind of a canopy of lighting up above. With LED lighting, you can get fairly close to the canopy, so even though there's going to be some bleed over into the other light areas, we'll still get a good idea because I'll be able to put the fixtures fairly close, 6 to 12 inches away from the light canopy. Some of that bleed over, though, for me is interesting because the fixtures have different color temperatures or different spectrums, and there might be something interesting to happen in that bleed over. So I'll be reading the color temperature of the canopy in these certain areas and collecting data on, the differences around the canopy that's underneath these lights. One of, so right now I've got the Spider X Plus, Spectre, and the BIOS lighting, the GI2, and then 2 Vipers, because I always have people asking me what's better, the Viper or the Spider. I tell them it has nothing to do with the using the Spider or the Viper. It has more to do with your layout and your design than anything else. I like the Viper X Plus a lot because it's a single bar that's fat and covers like a 4x3 foot footprint fairly well, and there's a lot that you can do around that light, whereas a Spider kind of takes up all of the space above the light. And I see a lot of these companies modeling their fixtures off of that architecture, lighting architecture. And I don't know if that's the best lighting architecture for indoor cultivation, because a lot of times people are just designing these lights thinking about the light canopy, but they're not thinking about everything else that's involved in an indoor grow space, which is environment, leaf surface temperature, the way that the air is moving, how the lights can work with the environmental equipment. A lot of people are just kind of thinking like, we need to get this amount of PPFD over this amount of square footage. And to some extent that can be great, but we're seeing a lot more of these vertical moving systems, or these vertical rack systems that move, and they open up and you have one aisle. So it's modeling after a roll top bench, but just going up vertically. So when you start cramming all these lights and plants together into this home position where you've got rows and rows of these plants and there's not a lot of air movement, people have been having a lot of challenges with that. So looking at how now these lights like the Spider X Plus is being repurposed for these vertical moving systems, I'm also thinking about how the architecture of the light can fit that model to allow for more space or for the environment and environmental control, which has been a serious challenge for a lot of the people that are using these LED vertical moving rack systems. Now, the other thing that I've been looking at is that I have noticed that certain varietals under the Fluence lighting will, the spectrum, for whatever reason, they'll just get what I call tired after a specific amount of light or duration of light, even at the lower ppfd. So let's say between 200 and 300 ppfd in veg, after 16 hours of light, the plants, a lot, and I've seen this in multiple grows, and it could be something else, but I haven't collected enough data on everything, but I have seen consistency with that with other individuals online, where certain varietals just get tired and they start to droop, like they've had enough and it's time to turn off and it's time to go to sleep. I never saw that really under high pressure sodium lighting or ceramic metal halide lighting. I have seen that from the get-go with the Fluence lighting. I've had to make adjustments, and then certain things became more important, like vapor pressure deficit or VPD, vapor pressure differential, and then adjusting the intensity of the lighting and really having to work very hard on keeping the plants healthy so the photosynthesis continues and transpiration continues. Now, I think that has something to do with the spectrum of the light and the color temperature, and I think there might be a little bit too much of something and not enough of something else. So part of what I've done is I've looked at other lighting companies that have different spectrums and tried to compare to see if it's something with the lighting. Now, I will say that right now I'm using the BIOS light in the trial, so it's really the Spectre light is pretty close to the Fluence light as far as spectrum and design. It's a little egregious to some extent how close it is. The BIOS lighting is kind of its own beast. It was developed by a NASA scientist, which is kind of cool because I'm all about space travel and NASA and all these kinds of things. Side note, and I have been vegging. I have plants vegging under the BIOS lighting and plants the same gelato strain vegging under the Fluence lighting, and I have noticed off the bat right now that the plants are enjoying the color temperature a little bit better in the vegetative state under the BIOS lighting at the same ppfd without getting that tiredness. Now, I don't know if that makes the BIOS lighting spectrum better for vegetative, and whether that's going to carry over, and I'm going to see a benefit in flower because I've had fantastic results with the Spider X Plus in flower, but it does make it a little bit easier for me when I'm not having to deal with the plants getting stressed out from having too much. Maybe it's too much red. I don't know. So those are my early findings right now, and I'm going to be making some more videos on that and posting that up on Instagram and on YouTube. And I will say one thing, that BIOS light is really heavy. It is, I think it's like 40 or 50 pounds. And that is not a one-man job hanging that light. Whereas the Spider, I can hang that light, one-man job on that. The BIOS light, you're definitely going to need, the GI2 at least, you're going to need two people to hang that light. Just a warning. I was surprised on how heavy it is. And so I like the spectrum on the BIOS light, but it's heavy and it doesn't have the same radiant cooling design that the Fluence light has. So the top of the fixture gets very hot, like 140, 150 degrees. So just keep all that in mind. So there's positives and negatives to both fixtures so far from what I've found.
Okay, so a couple of thoughts hearing you talk about that. One, could you say that maybe the Fluence light has a potentially better spectrum in the sense that you could shorten your photo period because the plant's reaching its DLI, or the amount of light that the plant can take up in a given photo period, sooner. So maybe you could take an hour off of your vegetative period and still get the same growth rates?
Yeah, I like to veg under Fluence lighting for 16 hours of light and 18 hours of darkness. So yeah, that is a benefit. I don't know if it's comparably if that creates more growth or not, but you're not running the lights for 2 additional hours. I've told that to a lot of people, and that have asked me about that. I've seen this tiredness thing as well. And I said, we'll switch to 16 hours of light and 8 hours of darkness. And a lot of people are hesitant to do that because it's been kind of the standard to veg for either 18/6 or 24 hours. But I'd say if you're using the Fluence light, try vegging for 16 hours. That was actually their initial recommendation when they first put out the light, and a lot of people weren't willing to do that because they were afraid that the plants were going to flower.
Yeah, you are getting closer to that photoperiodic response. I'm really excited to hear what Travis Higginbotham comes up with over the next year as he gets sort of more entrenched and experienced in his position. He was our last podcast interview, and I really like his knowledge and what he had to say. So I'll have to follow up with him again on that one. So that was one thought. And then my other thought is, if a light is getting really hot, doesn't that mean that in a sense it's less efficient at converting energy into photons? And I'm not criticizing this light. It's just I'm just talking out loud about. I don't know a lot about lighting, so.
Yeah. So wattage. No matter wattage is going to create a specific amount of BTUs, right? So if you have 600 watts, you're going to have 600 watts of heat, right? And that heat, I think it's for every watt, you multiply that times 3.41 BTU or 3.14 BTU. Forgive me if I get the 4 and the 1 mixed up. And then that's how you figure out how much heat, which the engineers call sensible load, is going into the room for the fixture. So it doesn't, and that has to do with any electronic device, right? Any electronic device, any device that's powered is, that amount of wattage is going to it is going to create that amount of heat. Now, this is something that people get confused about. So just because you're running an LED doesn't mean that, so let's say you have 600 watts of LED lighting, and then you have 600 watts of high pressure sodium lighting. They're going to produce the same amount of heat. All right. The difference is that from the 600 watt high pressure sodium light, you're only getting, let's say, 400 or 500 ppfd. So 400 to 500, the amount of photons that are being produced that's usable for the plant, it's like 400 to 500. Whereas with the LED, that's the same amount of wattage, you're getting 1,000 or 1,100. So it's producing the same amount of heat, but more usable light. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so in theory, you could use less lights, which would also lower the amount of heat being created in a given room, potentially,
and get the same amount of ppfd as the 600 watt high pressure sodium. Correct. Now, why is there so much heat coming off of the BIOS light? That has to do with the architecture and has to do with the way that the light is designed to handle the diffusion of that heat. All right. Now, it seems like BIOS has opted to go with more of a waterproof, kind of very heavy duty design, which I can understand why they would do that. Whereas, they have 4 big chunky bars in a series, and then you look at the Fluence light, and they've got 8 bars. And the Fluence light has these fins that you would see. They're the radiant cooling fins, so it spreads the surface area to allow for better heat diffusion of the fixture. So there's more surface area there. It's the same thing that you'd see on on one of your ballasts or any kind of power source where there's a lot of wattage going into something or a lot of energy going into something. They create those fins. You see it in computer equipment as well, and that allows for greater air movement over the surface of the equipment to allow for better air heat dispersion and diffusion. So when you're measuring you get your little laser thermometer and measure the Fluence light, it does a very good job at dispersing that heat into the environment. So as long, what I think about is like being able to control the room environment. And if I have just ambient heating and it's being dispersed, I mean, that heat is now being spread around the volume of the room. So it's easier to manage. It's easier for the equipment to, cool that room. Whereas if you have hot spots, which is what we're trying to stay away from in cultivation, where we have these pockets of heat, pockets of humidity, pockets of coldness, we don't want that. We want it to be consistent. So that's the only thing that, that's one of the positives of having an LED fixture is you get that when you look at your ambient temperature, you're really kind of seeing, what's close to what your canopy temperature is. And then when you have a high pressure sodium light, it's going to be very, very hot under that bulb because that's where a lot of that heat is coming from. Now, I will say the BIOS light, the heat is being thrown up to the top of the fixture. And when you're below the LED diodes, it's not anywhere near as hot, but you still have that hot spot above the light. So if you've got really tall ceilings, not a big deal. But in this lab, I don't have tall ceilings, and I'd say that the fixture was heating up the ceiling, which was about 1.5 feet away. Um, it was 20 degrees higher than I was getting under the Fluence light. So Fluence has done a really good job in figuring out how to disperse that heat. And that's kind of my little analysis on all of that.
Well, I'm excited to hear your results. That's really cool what you're doing.
Thanks, man. Me too. I'm super grateful for all the lighting companies that have been open to doing this, because I know that everyone wants. They don't want any. I'm not trying to do any damage to any of these companies at all. It's really just trying to give a fair test, so we can look at what's positive, and then all those companies can kind of come back and use that data to improve what they're doing, because they're all doing something that's fantastic and unique and exciting, and it's all this is just going to lead to more efficient cultivation methodology, and I'm all for that.
So the last thing I wanted to talk to you about was sort of your experiences with the different, facilities and grow operations that you've been doing consulting on. What are you seeing out there in California right now?
I am seeing a lot of fat, if that makes sense. So I'm seeing a lot of waste. I'm seeing a lot of cultivators and farms struggling to make the transition over into a commercial business framework, and not having a lot of time to do that, because things are moving lightning fast and it's chaotic and it's very, very difficult. And what worked for the last 10 to 15 years doesn't really work anymore, because the margins have gone down. And I remember a few years ago listening to Bob Hoffman, who's one of the largest basil growers in the United States, talk to a bunch of cannabis growers, and he said, "Hey guys, guess what? Your margins, they're great now. They're not going to last forever. Enjoy it while you can, because it's going to go away sooner than you think." And that's what I'm seeing happen right now. But people are still cultivating and growing cannabis. Their cost to produce a pound is still above $500 on average. And we have an oversupply in California, much like what's going on in Washington and Oregon, even though Washington and Oregon have a much further developed recreational market than California does. But people forgot that California's been producing a lot of weed for a really long time, and now all those people are having to pay taxes, and there's a lot of taxes, probably too many taxes, and they haven't really figured out how to reduce their cost of production. I would say that some people have started to, and it's beginning to happen, but they have to do it faster, and they have to take take a cue from large scale agriculture to some extent, if they're trying to do these massive farms and really try and reduce costs. So I see a lot of waste. I see a lot of money being spent on things that aren't maybe needed, and improper planning to understand what you guys are going to need on the OpEx moving into these grows. They're kind of going about it the way that they've been going about it for the last 10 years, and a lot of people are failing, and a lot of people are hurting because of it.
So what do you see as a viable solution? Like, if you were starting a grow or helping someone that was starting a grow, how do you go about analyzing efficiency and finding ways to improve that?
Well, what I recommend everybody begin with is a quote unquote plant program. So what I'll see happen a lot of times is people will start out with a rough idea of what they want to do in their space, and then they will lay on top of that space a thought that they can do more than is actually possible. So every space that you're working in, whether it's outdoors, whether it's a greenhouse, or whether it's an indoor cultivation space, it's going to have a limitation on how much can be produced. cramming more into that space is actually going to reduce the output than if you were to meet the space with where it's maybe operationally tuned. So one of the first things I like to do is sit down and look at the space and create a layout and a floor plan for where every plant is going to go, and then base expectations on what's going to be produced on what the space can actually handle. So once we've established that floor plan, now this is assuming that you have your areas or rooms already kind of mapped out. Then after that, then we look at what the current equipment is in the facility, or the spec. We talk about what we're going to spec for the equipment, but a lot of times I'm coming in and doing audits on facilities that were already built and they were poorly planned from the get-go for whatever reason. So what we have to a lot of times reduce people's expectations and what they can pull out of the space by looking at what the space can actually handle. So we'll go from plant count to what our equipment sizing is, and then we'll figure out, the optimum amount of plants that can be in each room based on keeping a controlled environment, based on what the equipment can handle. And then we'll come up with a flow for where the plants begin, in the facility, whether they're starting as a clone or a seed, and where they're going to end. And we map out every part of that process, and then essentially run a digital form of the operation to give the client or give the farmer an idea of the path of his grow room and every expendable, every supply that's needed to get that plant from point A to point Z. A lot of times people are just kind of winging it. And what happens when you wing it is you waste a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of labor. So the first thing to do is come up with a plan, an operational plan, and a plant program, and have, manage your expectations of what you're going to actually produce out of the space. Whether you're a nursery or whether you're producing for flower, there's going to be a limit. You can't, if you have enough space for 10,000 clones or 5,000 clones to be produced per month, that's all you're going to get. You're not going to get any more than that unless you expand your space in an intelligent way. So that's a lot of what I've been doing now is looking at that, analyzing why there are fail points, and offering people solutions. And a lot of that has to do with reducing what they're trying to do within the limitations, about getting real with the limitations of your farm.
So what you're describing is very similar to what Ben Hartman was talking about around lean farming or lean manufacturing, in terms of setting up and really understanding workflows. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, his book is awesome. And
I bugged you for a while there. I was like, you need to read this book.
Yeah.
So
no, that I would say that I've worked with some engineering companies on the pre-production that's involved in planning out these gardens. But after reading that book, it really helped me turn it into something tangible after the plan was finished. And also understanding how to really think about how you plan your garden. A lot of people are just starting with like an empty rectangle and they're trying to fill it in with as many plants and as much canopy as possible. Also, just because you have a 20,000 square foot building doesn't mean you're going to get a 10,000 square foot canopy out of that. There's a lot of space needed for the actual operations, plant movement, all these kinds of things. So for the first 3 years of doing some of this facility design, I'd work with the owner of the building and they'd be like, we got a 20,000 square foot building. Let's put a 20,000 square foot canopy in the building. And it's like, where are you going to take a shit? It's like people aren't even thinking about that. So that book was a huge influence on how all of these things kind of work together. And the lean farm, man, that's it. So, amen. Thank you for turning me on to that book. And thank you for that podcast. Great podcast.
Well, I think people just need to spend time planning. Time spent planning is not time wasted. In fact, it's probably the most efficient thing you can do. And I'm a culprit of this even now I don't have as much SOP or standard operating procedure established as I should. Because realistically, when you're running a business or running an operation like this, you need everything to be standardized as much as possible, so the employees know what their expectations are, and at the same time have a resource that they can go to understand what they should be doing and why they're doing it too. And that's something that you should have already thought about, hopefully, in a perfect world before starting your business. But that's not what happened in my case, not even close. But we're working towards that, you know?
Yeah, a lot of I think that's the case. I think that's the case with most people. Also, the other thing is a lot of times people write an SOP and they spend a lot of time and money doing that, and then they get their garden built and then no one follows it. So the SOP actually has to make sense and has to be applied to what's actually going on. I see that all the time. I'll see like a manual. That manual just gets dust all over it. No one's actually going and using it, and you've got operators that are coming in and kind of doing their own thing and setting their whole rules. And that might be that's a kind of interesting thought too. Is like the SOP manual the best way to be creating best practices? I think that SOP manual is there to kind of be the backbone, the history of how the building is going to be operated. But then what gets put into practice in the business should be simplified. We've even talked about, having there be a, iPad in the room that has just the videos on the iPad for every part of the process for someone to reference, because so many people are learning things off of YouTube and online streaming services. Maybe our SOP should be geared towards how people are actually learning these days. Less people are, learning. I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people are learning through online services and podcasts like this one and YouTube, and you need to learn something quick. It's a lot easier to have it shown to you than have to go through and read the directions and hope that you're reading it correctly and then translating it into reality. So maybe we need to be looking at how we structure our SOPs, depending upon what we're writing the SOP for, of course. But maybe there's a better way of having these best practices displayed for the staff. So that's something that I've been kind of playing around with, maybe perhaps turning Poetry of Plants into an instructional company where there's videos online to show every part of these processes for different steps. It's something that might be interesting.
That's funny because for me, I tend to not like videos as much. I like hearing things, obviously with having a podcast, that's something I enjoy, but I love to read, and I love to read things and see them visually that way. But if it's something complicated, like putting together furniture, it would be a great example. Having a visual guide, like a video, like you said, is pretty handy. Or maybe it's like mixing up fertilizer. That's something that is pretty easy to screw up off of a set of written instructions. So I think that's a great idea. I do like that. Yeah. And yeah,
everyone learns different too, right? So some people are better at reading or listening or watching. So maybe you have to have a combination of all three, to really have it make sense, and the staff can access it based on how they prefer to learn. Make it easy for them.
Yeah, that gets a little controversial in terms of what they've come up with in education around research and learning, but we don't need to get into that. That was sort of something that I did with my master's degree, but.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I want to get into that. Can you briefly tell?
Well, the basics would be that, this idea of sensory learning, that some people are auditory learners or some people are visual learners. They found when they actually did a lot of research on it, it didn't really play out quite as well as people thought. So there is something to having different modalities of teaching in terms of the way you explain or teach a subject, but no one is a single modality in the way that they learn. They don't just learn from an auditory perspective or from a visual perspective or from a sensory perspective. So it's a little it gets a little more complicated than that, I guess. But it is interesting, and I do see younger generations being much more focused or more interested in watching videos and learning from videos than prior generations, like myself, I guess.
Well, I have a 9-year-old son, and we do a lot of Legos. And if you look at the Lego instruction manual, it's like step by step with a picture and with the direction of how this is getting put together. Even something, I mean, and anybody can figure out how to put together a Lego for the most part. So maybe there's a combination of those things like we were talking about, just something where people actually can access the best practices and the standards, and they know what the standards are. Because a lot of times I walk into the facility and people don't know, and they just end up, they get shown it once or twice, and then they end up creating their own method. And that, maybe that could be a better method or maybe not, but that's something for the operation manager and the operational management to decide, not a new hire. So I just see these kinds of things where it's, back to what we were talking about as far as lowering the operational costs, improving quality, lowering the cost of production, and really taking a cue from other companies that have been successful. And that's what I would recommend if you're a cannabis cultivator. A lot of people are touring a lot of cannabis farms. It's not the place to find the best information on agricultural best practices. Like, go to a real farm. Go to, I wouldn't say cannabis is not a real farm, but go to an agricultural farm, a produce farm that's dialed in, that's successful. See if you can get a tour of their facility and see how they're doing their processes, because those are the processes that are going to be applied to cannabis in the future. Might as well learn it now.
Yeah, I see a lot of reluctance from people saying that, the horticultural world or the agricultural world doesn't understand cannabis, and has frankly been a little bit arrogant towards cannabis because it has been a black market crop and a plant to grow for so long. But at the end of the day, there's so much more research and science that we have this existing body of work to pull from if we look at what's going on, in commercial greenhouses and what's going on commercial farms and how they're establishing workflows and how they're processing plants. Yes, cannabis is a special plant in a lot of ways, but I think in the way that we cultivate it, in most cases, I mean, there's some things around photoperiod and such and nutrients, but overall it's another plant. And I think people get too caught up in sort of this spirituality around the plant that they aren't willing to embrace some of the knowledge that's already out there or go in search of it when they could.
Yeah, I think that's because they're afraid. That's what I think. I think it's scary because it's moving into becoming an actual business and less of a lifestyle. And that's a lot of people don't want to let that go. And I get it. I understand that. But and maybe, yeah, that might be true. Big Ag doesn't know how to grow cannabis yet. I would say they'll figure it out at some point, and maybe they won't figure it out to the point that, not to take away the experience and the artisanship that these cannabis farmers have developed, because they absolutely have. I mean, I haven't seen too many people coming from Big Ag that can grow the same level of flower that people that have been cultivating and working with the plant for 20 years, because it does become like playing an instrument, right? If you're doing it for so long, you develop a sixth sense, you develop a skill set around it. But that's great. Now let's figure out how that artisanship that you amazing cannabis cultivators have developed in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years can now be applied within the agricultural format. So go meet those people, become friends with them, see if you can, bring them information they don't know about. So they will be open to show you guys what they're doing and how they're able to reduce their costs, because you're not going to have an opportunity to cultivate cannabis if you're still spending $600, $700 to produce a pound. I mean, you won't be able to survive. So we have to just let those take off the armor. Let's have an open conversation about this being a plant. The stigma's going away. And let's figure out a better way of cultivating it so the people that have been working with the plant and developing the artisanship that make it so special can stay in the game. And that's really what I try and help people out with. And I'm learning how to do that every day. And I'm learning from the PhD greenhouse manager that grows, microgreens, and I'm learning that from the Humboldt farmer that's using KNF living soil methodologies. I mean, there's something of value to learn from all of those people, and then you just work on merging those worlds, finding the similarities of where they all can meet and improve. There's no ceiling to how we can improve how we cultivate plants at this point. Like, I don't see the ceiling. I think there's so much more to learn.
So that's the real challenge then, is how do we scale these methods, or how do we scale an artisan farmer in order to stay relevant as this industry blows up?
That is a great question, and I would go. I'm going to reference a lot of what Ben talked about in Lean Farm. Is we have to scale the cannabis farm. We have to know what the consumer wants to buy, right? So scaling is it's be partly connected to what we're growing and what we're growing it for. And I don't think we really know what that is yet. I think that's being developed. And why I'm saying that is I'm seeing that flower is becoming less valuable on the market than all the derivatives, right? So I'm seeing a lot of vape pens, a lot of, hash derivatives and variations of hash becoming more popular and more convenient for consumption than having a jar of flower. I love cannabis flower. It's always number one for me. I mean, it's something that I love the experience of the flower. I love looking at the flower. I love smelling the flower. But a lot of the new people that are coming online, they don't want to go around smelling like a flower. And also they maybe prefer the different delivery methods. So thinking about that, and we have to think like, well, what is the percentage of the flower going to be? Like, what is the retail sales of flower going to be as we move forward? Is it going to be 70%, 80% of what it's kind of been, or is it going to be more like 5 to 10% of the market? So if it ends up going to where I think it's going to go, where it's going to be a much smaller margin on the market, and we're going to be moving towards these derivatives, then it doesn't matter as much. I hate to say it, but it doesn't matter as much as if you're producing like these really crazy looking flowers. So if that's the case, then, because those crazy looking flowers, those amazing, beautiful flowers take a lot of energy, a lot of time, and a lot of money to produce. And if people aren't willing to pay a fair market price for them, then they're not going to be around. And that's kind of, what I see. If it costs $600 to produce a AAA beautiful top shelf pound of the most highest level flower, and you can only sell it for $700, which is like the cost of producing it, or $800, then that flower is going to go away until it can command a higher value. And what we're going to see is large scale operations where it's not as, the focus isn't necessarily on the aesthetic of the flower. It's going to be more on the chemical concentrations that can be produced and how much of it can be produced. So answering your question, if we're looking at a derivative market and we're producing cannabis for a derivative market, why are we applying the same methodologies and costly methodologies of producing very, very high quality or close to the high quality flower if it's just going to be turned into a derivative in the first place? So a lot of people haven't thought about that, in my opinion, my humble opinion. They've designed these massive facilities that have cost a lot of money, and then over half or 70% of all of what they're producing is being turned into some kind of derivative. So if you are planning your cannabis business and you want to grow flower, God bless you. I love it. Keep it going. If you have a brand behind you, even better. You'll probably be more successful with that if your brand has any kind of market share. But if you're just getting into this, really think about what percentage of your sales are going to be flower sales. And if you come to the same conclusion that I am, which is that it's going to be lower than all the derivatives, then build a facility out with economies of scale in place and focus on producing biomass that can be turned into derivatives, which requires a lot less input and energy than it does if you're growing for flower. Kind of roundabout answer, but does that make sense?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that here in Washington. people moving towards more concentrates and moving away from flower in a lot of ways, which I agree with you is a little bit unfortunate, but it is the reality of where the industry is. Now you can get cannabis sugar and cannabis gummies and cannabis chocolate and pretty much anything you want.
And you have no idea what that plant looked like.
No, you have no idea what the plant looked like. You don't know what it was grown with. You don't know the quality of the flower. All you really are getting are these constituent cannabinoids, essentially. So
yep.
Who knows? And that's a little scary to me in a lot of ways, just because.
Me too.
We've already talked about this. We don't know about, pesticides. We don't know about heavy metals. Yes, there's some testing going on around it, but the regulations have not caught up with the laws in a lot of ways. So I guess we're just going to have to wait and see how it all pans out. But there are people still growing high quality flower out there. I know quite a few, but it is getting tougher and tougher. So the market is changing.
Yeah, and I don't want those people to. I'm saying this not because I like the reality of it. It's just the reality of it. And there's some amazing cultivators that I'm hoping that it'll swing back the other way, and then we'll, at some point when everything's kind of calmed down a bit, there's going to be a clearly defined market for boutique, really high quality cannabis flower. But please, if you grow really, really, really awesome epic flower, you are valuable and you're important and you're special, and that's an art form and it's a craft. Use your head though. Make smart business decisions so 5 to 10 years from now you can continue to grow that flower. And that might mean you have to be a little bit nimble on what you want it, with where your direction, where your trajectory is at, with where it should be to survive. Because this is survival mode for most cannabis companies right now, unless you've got hundreds of millions of dollars behind you and you can afford the crazy burn rate. So please, if you are one of these craft growers, and I see these flowers all the time and I love it, I don't want to see them disappear. Figure out how to survive. Think about a longer term plan and thinking about, what you might have to pivot and grow lower quality product that's going to go to derivatives just to be able to keep the business open. That is not anything you should really stress out about. You should just be like, okay, this is what I have to do right now. Trust that it's going to come back around. The artisanship will survive. But that's only going to survive if the artists continue to produce. If they all get out of the game because it's too tough, then what are we going to be left with? So please, make smart business decisions. Be okay with yourself. No one's going to judge you if you've got to grow flower for derivatives for whatever reason. Just keep going. Please stick around, because the art that you've brought to the cannabis community is so important. And it would hurt if all of those people disappeared and we just had, massive hedge funds growing, mid-grade product, and that was all that was available. That's a possibility. That's definitely a possibility. And it could be like, the beer industry, where it took like 30, 40 years for craft beer to come out, to come back into the fold. And I would just say, let's be smart about it to keep the artisan growers around. I think it's really important.
Well, I know this podcast is cannabis cultivation and science, but I almost want to have someone on to talk about marketing and branding, because
you should.
I want people to survive. These like artisan growers, like you mentioned, the only ones I know of that are really thriving right now or succeeding are the ones that have really, really strong marketing branding. And so they've captured, a certain demographic of their community that is firm believers in what they're doing. And they've been able to share the message of how they're cultivating with a larger audience. And unfortunately, that's so important for companies nowadays. And it's something that I've had to learn the hard way myself with my business. I was spending way too much time arguing obscure scientific references with other people online when I should have been marketing my business. I would be a much more successful businessman right now. And part of starting this podcast was a way for me to get some of my message, but also a greater message of what the philosophy of people that I believed in or had access to out to other growers, so they won't make the same mistake with their businesses that I did. So,
yep.
Learn from my mistakes too in that regard, and really invest in that as as much as I hate marketing and branding, and I have to be careful because my fiance is a marketing director here. I don't think she listens to all my podcasts, but it's not something that I'm terribly passionate about. And you really have to find someone that's really going to take your business to the next level if you want to be successful, because there's so many aspects around social media now. We're a global economy, and it's so important that we reach out beyond just our local area and people really find out what you're doing. So even if you're limited to a particular state with your cultivation, getting your message out there to as wide of an audience as possible is only going to help you be more successful.
Absolutely.
And
that's a skill. That's another skill set, and that's the thing is sometimes some of the best growers in the world, they don't know how to do that, and it's going to be a challenge, and maybe there's some kind of a boutique grower farm management company that could emerge out of all this, that could help organize and create a channel or a freeway for a lot of these boutique growers that just want to grow, so they can continue to be supported and successful, as long as it was done in an ethical way and a responsible way, and it wasn't some crazy, we're going to control and own everything that you're doing kind of thing. Because I think it's important that people still feel the sense of freedom that they had when they were cultivating in the black market. I mean, it was a free feeling to be in there, and not that it was all a good thing, right? Like, you had people spraying a bunch of crap on all the plants and everything, but being in that space where you're kind of outside of society and you're creating, you got like wings that are so large no one can see, and there's something about that is inspiring. And then once you get put into the system and the structure, and you've got all these boxes you have to check off, it can limit that creative experience. Well, maybe there's a way of still creating that creative experience inside of the structure. Maybe something that could be discussed at a further date. You can kind of see that in some other industries, but it's hard.
Yeah, I know for me with my business, trying to hire outside help with marketing became really, really expensive and really challenging. And I wasted, thousands of dollars on this in terms of hiring the wrong people, or not getting what I thought I was getting out of it, or investing in avenues that were just not, were not productive. So putting money into, maybe ads wasn't the right revenue source for my business. And these are all trial and error things. And it's really, really tough for a grower, especially someone without a marketing background, to figure all of that out and get into the industry and figure out where they should be putting their money into marketing so that it's the most effective. And a lot of that's data analysis and requires having a lot more information than the average grower is going to have. We're fairly insulated in what we do. So there's a lot of challenges around marketing and branding, and maybe I will have to have someone on to kind of talk about that if there's an interest. If there's an interest, please, people, reach out, shoot me an email. Let me know if you're interested in me talking about that with someone. But I know we have a lot of other people that are just cultivating for themselves or on a medical level where they don't really need or want that information too. So,
I think there's a good friend of mine who always said that everyone in the cannabis business, up until recently, has been doing business, but they haven't been in business. And now we have to be in business. We can't just be doing business. So I think all that information and coaching on that is really important, and how it applies to the cannabis world and how it's being shaped. It'll be great.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for your time today. Was there anything else you wanted to cover before we sign off?
No, it's pretty good. I'm just I'm excited to get to work, to follow through and continue on with this podcast that we have coming up, the Dope History Podcast, and really looking forward to this next year. It's going to be a lot of fun.
That was Nelson Lindsley from Poetry of Plants. You can follow him on Instagram at Poetry of Plants. That's all one word.
And you can follow us at Kiss Organics. That's with one S. You can also check out his website at www.poetryofplants.com. He's an excellent consultant, and his team can help with facility design, operational training, and state applications. The Dope History Podcast is going to be an amazing project and something we are both really excited about. It's taking us longer than expected to get it published, but you can follow along at Dope History Podcast on Instagram and www.dopehistory.com. The narratives we've heard so far are really fascinating, and the history behind this plant and the effect it's had on our culture and the people involved in bringing us towards legalization is just incredible. You are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey. Don't forget that there's more information and articles available on our website and blog at www.kisorganics.com. And if you enjoy these podcasts, please take a moment to leave me a review on iTunes or whatever platform you're listening on, and send me your feedback and suggestions through our website contact page. Thanks for listening.